Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. Today I'm joined by Dr. Wendy Maddocks, who is a nurse academic at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. She has been researching all the New Zealand nurses who served in World War I and has explored pilgrimages after the war. In addition, she has made multiple personal pilgrimages to sites that are sacred to Australian and New Zealand forces. Welcome, Wendy. It's so nice to finally meet you across the distance, but in real time, and to hear about your really interesting and inspiring work.
Thanks, Heather. And it's really, really lovely to be here and to be sharing a little bit of New Zealand with your listeners, and really looking forward to talking about nurses, but also pilgrimage from a New Zealand perspective in more detail.
And I can't wait to hear more about this perspective. It's one that has been missing from the overall work that I've been doing, and it's been missing, I think, from the conversation about post-World War I pilgrimages. So you're really filling in some gaps in terms of my personal knowledge, but also I think the larger pilgrimage community's knowledge about these iterations of pilgrimages. I'm really curious how you became interested in nursing and then how your career progressed into academia, and then how you began to research the stories and lives of nurses in World War I.
Cool. Well, the only reason I went nursing many, many, many years ago was back in those days, you got paid and it was a qualification that I could travel with. So 17-year-old me thought, great, I had no great passion to be a nurse. I thought I'd do it for a few years and go off and I actually wanted to be a pilot, was my real passion. And I applied to the Air Force from high school. And firstly, they said, well, women can't be pilots. We now know that not to be true. And also I'm very, very short-sighted. And they said, well, there's other roles you could have done in the Air Force, but your eyesight's not good enough. So plan B was, okay, I want to travel. So I signed up to do nursing in the old school way of hospital training, and built a really, really good clinical career over many years. I travelled the world, actually worked in America for a bit, UK, and carried on sort of studying, and then got into education after 8 or 9, 10 years in a clinical sort of space. And life, like for most people, very ordinary, working, raising a family, doing more study, and always had an interest in history. And I'm very, very blessed. My dad never had any formal education, but he was an avid reader and lover of history. And so there was always history books and things. So Friday night would be a visit to the library, and we'd get a whole lot of books out, and I'd be getting my books out from the adult grown up section of the library, not the kids section of the library. And we'd walk home with our bags of books and pick up some chocolate on the way home. And that was it. So it's always been part of my life. And as sort of time went on, the way I trained with my nursing now doesn't exist. And somewhere along the way, I thought there's a story in there about the old school hospital training. And the school I trained in was the last one in New Zealand to offer that sort of training. And the world's first registered nurse was in that hospital way before my time, 1893. And COVID happened. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect opportunity to actually write a book about my training hospital and go through archives and interview nurses and recollect that moment in time. And through that, I found a particular World War I nurse who had trained at my hospital and had gone to serve, and all sorts of things happened, and things went very, very wrong. And if I can just do a little, wee little plug. So I was so entranced with her that I wrote a book about her and her diary and her letters. And I thought, no, there's got to be more to this. These nurses, their stories weren't well known. And I had, and we'll see in the slides, gone on a historical trip. And I thought, no, I need more of them to be understood. And once COVID was over and travel was able to start again, because of course New Zealand, we had quite strict lockdowns and we actually couldn't leave our country for 2 years. And just really catching up and going to some of these places where nurses had served, had worked, the hospitals, and I've managed to, as well as Turkey, Gallipoli, Greece, England, Belgium, and Egypt last year was the last sort of link that I wanted to go and be in these places. This particular nurse, she had champagne suppers on the Sphinx with various officers, and she swam in a tangerine bathing costume in the Suez Canal as the German planes went overhead. So really inspiring, and it just really I wanted to make their stories more visible and people to actually be aware that the nurses were there. They were very, very close to the front. They were under duress. And for our New Zealand nurses, some didn't come home, of course, and some didn't come home for many, many years afterwards and came back very broken.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of set me off on a very interesting journey that's taken me to some wonderful places.
Yeah, I can imagine that the return was particularly difficult for nurses because the stories and their experiences just sort of go underground. And so they've had these really extreme experiences, extreme trauma while they're providing care. They're still at the front. And then their stories are not told or known about. And maybe for some of them, that's how they wanted life to be when they returned. But I can imagine for a lot of them, there was a challenge integrating back into home life because of the radical change in environment from being at the front lines and then coming back and adjusting to life in a non-combat setting.
Yeah, and I think part of that was due to our government at the time. So New Zealand as a society, we were quite an egalitarian society back then. Women had had the right to vote since 1893, I think it was, and our nurses were the first in the world to be registered. So they were, I believe, they were very independent, well-educated, well-informed women who had clear expectations of themselves in society. They weren't prepared to sort of sit back. Like they were there from day one that war was declared. 400 nurses signed up immediately. Well, they weren't allowed to sign up for starters. Britain said, we don't want the colonies involved at that point. But there was 400 nurses who were prepared to go and look after their boys. And they went away as very independent, educated young women who were highly skilled. Many came back broken, but when they came back, the government, they weren't provided with healthcare. They had to pay. The soldiers got their healthcare for free, and they weren't even allowed to attend Anzac Day parades, which is our key sort of commemorative moment. And when they eventually were allowed, had to sit at the back. So for a lot of those nurses, they were like, okay, yeah, you've done that. People, like the society, didn't like that. That was sort of like a government kind of thing. And there's huge number of documents around the professional fighting between our chief nurse and the government of the day, the letters and things that went on. So, and the longest nurses had been away was 5 years. So they sailed off and didn't come back for up to 5 years. So that's a huge chunk of time.
Wow. And they were so far away from home. This is why your work is so important, to help us understand the stories of these young women, and maybe some of them weren't so young. When you say that the nurses signed up, can you explain some of the context around what was New Zealand at this time, and what was its relationship within the greater empire, and were the nurses signing up to join units of soldiers that were leaving New Zealand, or were they joining kind of a bigger system of nurses and healthcare workers that were under the British Expeditionary Force?
Yes and no. At the time that war was declared, New Zealand did not have an army nursing force, so that's quite different
Okay.
to other countries. So that simply didn't exist.
Mhm.
There had been efforts since the Boer War of 1899, 1901, that there was recognition that there needed to be an army nursing service. There wasn't. And one wasn't formed until 31st of March 1915. But as soon as war was declared, nurses started petitioning the Ministry of Defence. And so much so that the Minister of Defence had to put an advert in the paper pleading the nurses to stop writing to him and stop annoying him, offering their service. And that Britain, there's a great little expression that Britain had said, New Zealand's job at that time for the war effort was to supply men, guns and horses in that order. And we supplied many, many horses, many, many men and many, many guns. And Australia would provide the health care. We wouldn't need New Zealand nurses. And that stance continued for quite a few months up until from August 1914 up until March. And a handful of nurses were allowed to go as sort of a symbolic gesture, but they weren't army nurses at that time. They were, and this is a really interesting thing, they weren't allowed to appear to be New Zealand. Okay, so they weren't allowed to wear their New Zealand medals. And what these nurses did, and I love this, they actually embroidered a little silver fern on their collars. And I just like to think that before the rest of the nurses arrived, that these nurses were there, and if they were caring for someone, they would be like, "It's all right, I've got you. I'm a Kiwi. You know, you'll be all right. I'm looking after you." But the British government, because they wanted to appear that they could manage this war themselves, and the healthcare that would be needed. So maybe if I start sharing my slides, and then we can see some of
Please.
this
Yes.
stuff. Bear with me for a moment. So I've titled this talk today "From the Uttermost Ends of the Earth," because if anyone's gone on pilgrimages to the Western Front and looked at a New Zealand memorial, and you can't quite see it there, but every memorial says "From the uttermost ends of the earth," and that very much. And we've got a little Kiwi up here that I've popped up there, and the New Zealand flag there. And part of what I think, and the questions that you're asking, I'd like to sort of go a step back before the war, just to give a sort of a bit of a sense of the overview of New Zealand society at that time, to understand then how we lead on to that concept of pilgrimage, if that's okay. Because some of those values and things would have influenced the thinking of people at that time. Little geography lesson. We are at the ends of the earth. We are at the bottom, in the middle of the huge Pacific Ocean there, which you can see, and we are a long way away from our neighbours. And Australia, of course, is our closest country, but it's not that close. It's 3 hours flying, a 3-hour flight away. And then we have many Pacific Island neighbours as well, but they're anywhere between 3 and 4 hours flying. So we've grown up as a country with I think, quite a unique sense of identity of who we are and our place in the world. And we're really proud of that as a nation. We're not a little Britain. We're not a little Australia. We're very closely aligned. Australia is our cousin, that's sort of the relationship, and it will always be that relationship. But we are very much a distinct sort of society. And that land that we now know as New Zealand was first occupied about 800 years ago by people who came from a place in the Pacific called Hawaiki. That physical location doesn't exist. It's believed to be any number of Pacific islands, and there's certainly common sort of languages and traditions and things between different Pacific islands. And these amazing navigators arrived in these huge waka or canoe, and they came to the land that we now know as New Zealand. And depending on where those waka landed, is how then the local tribes or iwi developed based on their waka. So they weren't, these original sort of inhabitants weren't a collective group of people at that time. They were separate islands, separate boats and things. And they formed our different iwi or tribes of Maori people, our indigenous people, and they established and settled themselves over the next hundreds of years. We do know that there was trade backwards and forwards between New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and possibly even as far as South America. Pre-European people were known by the name of their waka. They weren't, the term Maori as a word to describe these people was actually applied when the British arrived. I'll just take that one back off. Pre-European, it was not a peaceful time, of course. There was warfare between iwi. People were trying to obtain land, resources, and women. So a lot of activity in those times. The Europeans didn't arrive until the 1700s. Abel Tasman, Dutch explorer in 1642, he sailed down here, sailed around, but he never actually landed. But it's his name, that's the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. And then it wasn't until 1769, so what's that, 120 years later, that James Cook arrived from Britain. They knew that there was this great southern land, so he was sent to find it, chart it, navigate, and of course he did land. And it was a very, very close race between the British and the French, like literally a very close race. And there's one small part off to the side of Christchurch, a little town called Akaroa, that all the street signs are still in French, and people have French names because the French were trying to get their flag in the ground first. So, and they're very, very proud of that. Then New Zealand became a British colony in 1840, and that's a really key date in our times, that there was a treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, signed between the Crown, which was Queen Victoria, and the iwi Maori tribes around New Zealand. And I think one of the key things that we sort of know from this time, of course, Māori was not a written language, it was an oral language. But the first documented efforts to transcribe that language happened in 1814 and 1820, so quite very early on. And two chiefs, Māori chiefs, travelled to Cambridge University to produce a grammar book, so in anticipation that then this treaty could be written. The treaty is very much our founding document today. There remains controversy around interpretations of it that still impacts on our daily life, and we won't go into that here. But basically, there was an English version and a Māori language version, and they didn't actually marry up, and not everyone signed the same version. In 1860, New Zealand had its own land wars, and that was between the British Crown and the local indigenous people, Maori people. So that was what was happening. Was a whole lot of settlers were coming from Britain to this new land, that they'd bought land or were promised land, but it wasn't actually their land to be bought or sold. And so there was a lot of conflicts around that, and that eventually sort of settled down, and New Zealand society started to sort of evolve into something more familiar to what it is now. That was a very dark part of New Zealand history, and it's still something we, as a society, it's not taught a lot in our schools, but we're trying to sort of really bring that through. But some sort of key dates relating to pilgrimage is, of course, New Zealand was the first country in the world to give women the right to vote, so 1893, and we were the first country in the world to register nurses in 1901, which meant that nurses had to have a standard of training at a hospital that was sufficiently large enough to provide that training. We were ahead of Britain by some 20 odd years, given though at that time we were still a British colony. We were really thinking forward as a country. And then in 1907, we became a dominion. So we were self-governing. We had our own parliament, our own prime minister. So Great Britain was still not the boss, but it was still overseeing us. But we had a lot more control and laws and things around that. And the bit that I just wanted to show you there was the Gazette, which confirms that proclamation that we are a British colony, a dominion of Britain. So it just sort of sets the scene that New Zealand was, at the time of World War I, was still a very young country, but we were viewing ourselves as really quite an independent sort of country. And we'll start to explore what that actually means from a pilgrimage sense. Yeah. So I'll just go on to the next slide here. So when I started to sort of look at how pilgrimage as a concept is documented in the newspapers in New Zealand, the first time I could find it mentioned was in 1840, which is when the treaty was signed, and most of it related to those religious pilgrimages that are well known around the world. But also early colonial settlers described coming to New Zealand as a form of pilgrimage to this newly settled land. And at this moment, to sort of compare and contrast a little bit with Australia, Australia was essentially settled by convicts, not settlers. And I'm actually a first generation New Zealand. My mum was Australian, and her line of ancestry is some great convicts. They didn't do anything really bad. They just forged a cheque and stole some sheets, and they were sent out in the 1700s to Australia. And my dad is English. He came to New Zealand after the First World War to start a new life here. So I think like the psyche of New Zealand is based on people who chose to come here. Britain was very much seen as home, though, and that's often in documents I've seen, diaries and letters, that Britain, even though New Zealand is quite independent, people talked about Britain as being home. And so by that time that the First World War came about, the majority of people who signed up for service either would have been born in New Zealand or immigrated here as very, very young children in the 1870s to 1890s. And there was really active immigration, bringing in people, mainly European people, into New Zealand for the logging, putting in logging, coal, railway, gold mining, those kinds of things. But there was also a really large Chinese population who came for the gold mining as well. And there's Chinese communities that trace their ancestry right back to these times. And I just love this photo here of this very stern-looking mother. I think she's probably quite a well-to-do woman, and she's getting her son, sending him off to the First World War. And this photo was from 1914, but he was a sergeant, so you can already see that. So he was already in some sort of service at that time. So when war was declared, there was very much a sense of obligation to home, to supporting home. And New Zealand was there right from day one. So next slide, I've just got some facts and figures here to share with you. And again, this photo of a troop ship leaving, I think this was leaving the port of Lyttelton, which is the port nearest to me. New Zealand, our population at the time was around about 1 million people, including our Indigenous population. 100,000 people served, so that was more than 10% of our population went over. And by the end of the war, 50% of the male population had served overseas. So that per capita contribution was really, really high, and was actually the highest of all allied nations. Our casualties, the numbers killed during the war, is believed to be 16,700 people. And another 1,000 died in the 5 years afterwards relating to their war service. 111 transport ship charters were used to transport these troops. So each ship held about 800 to 1,000 people, and that's separate to the hospital ships. And this is the bit I really want to emphasise, because when we think about pilgrimage, I want to think about the time that it took. 48 days sailing, between 48 days and 2 months sailing to go from New Zealand to either UK or Egypt, which was where these first troop ships were going. So for those families that were left behind, they didn't know, when they would see their loved ones again, if they would see their loved ones again. And certainly for the nurses that I've researched, they were away for up to 5 years, was the longest time, without the ability to come back. The very, very few occasions that nurses could come back, particularly, the soldiers came back if they were wounded. That was okay, that, they did come back, but they didn't come back for a break or a rest and go back again. They only came back if they were wounded. And for the nurses, I think only about 3 cases where nurses were allowed leave to come back to care for an ailing parent or a parent had died. Otherwise, the nurses that were on the hospital ships probably had a slightly better deal of it, because the ship would come back. They might have a day or so to catch up with family, friends, and then they were straight back on their passage. So it's just really that sense of distance, from the uttermost ends of the earth. So when we think about pilgrimage, it's going back, thinking about how the dead are managed, and just need to check something. The policy at the time of the British government the British Empire, was that burying the dead would happen in military cemeteries near to the battlefields. And if we just think about, that the scale of the dead, the logistics of shipping, and the commemoration of all of those who made that ultimate sacrifice, the philosophy very much was everyone was equal, regardless of their rank, their race, or their class. And an overseas burial was held to be respectful. And of course, we all know that many, many thousands of people were never found, from all nations. And as there was no class distinction, the wealthy could not override and pay for some money to have their person come home. That just was not allowed. And despite the distance, considerable effort was made to try and establish connections with these far-flung places. And the New Zealand government supplied £93,000, which is about 12 million New Zealand dollars, which I think is about $7 million US dollars, for the establishment for their war graves. And many petitioned the governments in the 1920s and 30s for funds to be made available for family to travel to these places. But the government didn't want to set a precedent. We couldn't afford it. Be honest, the country was broke after the war, and they couldn't afford to send every family member somewhere. And thinking logistically, that time distance that for a family member to go from New Zealand, they're sailing for up to 2 months. They had to travel around and do things and then sail home. And that would take them away from their home, their business, their farm, those kinds of things. So the New Zealand High Commission had an office in London, though. So if people were in the area, they would support them and give them advice and support to do that. And I love this this little example of a pilgrimage. So the newspapers were a really key way of keeping people connected after the war. And individuals would write and publish accounts of their own pilgrimages and describing things so that, like by proxy, they were taking with them the spirit and the energy from the people back in New Zealand and describing so people could be reassured that their loved ones' graves were being cared for. And there was volunteer organisations, of course, like the Red Cross, that helped to facilitate families' relationships with war graves. And this Otago couple here, 1932, this was in the newspaper, anxious to convey to parents and relations of those who fell the information that the graves and burial grounds in every instance are maintained and in beautiful condition. They state that if parents and relatives themselves were attending to the graves, they could scarcely improve the conditions. And in 1926, there was a Christchurch branch of the Red Cross that invited families to view a film screening pilgrimage to war graves in France and had slides of Gallipoli graves. I couldn't find any version of that particular movie online, unfortunately. There may be a copy buried deep within our archives, but I know on YouTube there's other sort of versions if people want to look at that. And I know that notion of taking with you other people's emotions and thoughts, I've done that myself on personal journeys. I will say to people, I'm visiting XYZ cemetery, and, people will ask me to find or visit a particular grave or take a photo or do something like that, or carry out some small act of remembrance. And it's a great honour to do that, and it brings comfort because we are still at the uttermost ends of the earth. We haven't moved. It's still expensive to travel to Europe. It only takes 26 hours now. It's the shortest flight time. Certainly not 48 days, but it is still a long way away. And I'm just going to share now this. Bear with me for a moment. There we go. By chance, this little gem, I was in Auckland, which is North Island, in the war archives there a couple of weeks ago looking for some stuff. And it was just really timely that had this for this presentation. This was the first time I had seen or held this particular document. This was sent, the family of the soldier who was killed in Gallipoli, his sister was a nurse, and she has been quite well researched and features quite heavily in some exhibitions and things in New Zealand. And this particular document is a little bound volume, and it's says here, so this is the front of it. Inside, there's a page that has the name of the soldier, his number, his rank, his regiment, and where his grave is. Shrapnel Valley, plot 1, row 6, grave 9. So that's in Gallipoli. And an actual photo, very, very early photo of the grave. And this was sent to the family. And I can't imagine what it would have felt to receive such a thing, to find out that he has died, but I imagine it would have become a very tangible token, something to hold on to for that family in remembrance. And receiving this followed a long period of correspondence, which I'll just share here. So his sister, the nurse, she went off in 1915. She was on the July. She went in July 1915. If you look at the date on this letter, so she was writing copious letters to her brother in Gallipoli. He was already dead by that stage, but they didn't know. And they get this letter killed, returned to sender. And there was quite a pile of those in the archives. So just reading that correspondence relating to that, and she had another younger brother who was also fighting by that stage in France. And then they get this official document from Buckingham Palace, photo of the young man, let every day something time. I can't quite work that out. I'd have to from the back of the photograph. I'll have to work out what that actually says. I didn't do that before this, but what that would have meant to that family to know that, okay, he is dead. Here's his grave with his sign on, and then we get this official recognition of that. But I'm just going to take a little step back again and thinking about that notion of pilgrimage for our Maori people and their connections to the whenua or the land. And it is considered desirable now that when a Maori person dies, it's really important for them to go back to their own whenua, their own land, to be buried with their ancestors. And the spirit to head off from the very north of New Zealand and travel back to Hawaiki. And this is a really evocative image. Initially, the British government did not want any of its colonised people to be participating in the war. They felt like it wasn't their war. But also, if we remember back to what I was saying very early, there had been wars between Maori and the British Crown. And I think there was sort of a subtext that if we actually arm people that we've colonised, potentially, but then they were able to, the Maori very much wanted to be in the war and supporting the war effort. And this image is a really evocative image. In 1915 it was published. So this is a young Maori soldier charging two Ottoman Turk soldiers, and behind him is a Maori warrior spirit with him, with his mere, which would have been made out of greenstone, panamu, his very warrior-like face with his tattoos and his tongue, and he's taking that spirit of his ancestors with him. And these were published in the paper to really evoke that spirit of war and to encourage Maori participation in war. And I'm going to talk about this tree. This Pahutakawa tree is 800 years old, and it is on the very, very top part of New Zealand where the Pacific Ocean and the Tasman Sea, and you can stand there and you can see the two oceans meeting. That is the place where the spirit is meant to come to. They slide down its roots and go into the sea back to Hawaiki. And the spirit leaves the physical body, the waiora, it's called, the spirit, goes into the underworld and travels to a place called Three Kings Island. Then it comes out, waves goodbye to New Zealand, and returns off to the mythical place of Hawaiki, to where the ancestors are. And it is believed that when a person dies, that their spirit stays with that body for several days. And during that time, the body is not to be left alone at all, at any time. And that's very much in contemporary times. As soon, even when a body might be in the mortuary or the hospital, family will be staying there overnight, being there with the person. That body will go to a marae or meeting place, and people will stay there. And and people will sleep in the marae. They will live around where that person is. People will come and pay respects. say prayers, karakia, sing songs, children will be playing nearby. So it's seen both as very, very ordinary. It's just part of life, but also it's not secret. It's not hidden away, but it's also a really special and important time, and people will grieve together over that time as a collective grief. There might be things that are said in anger. A wife might be telling her husband off for all the things that he's left her to do. It all gets left out in that marae. It's shared, and then at the end, when the body for the a feast happens, and tapu, or the sacredness, is broken with that feast, and the grieving family come back to be with the living. And the body will be taken usually to their own land to be buried on. And then a year later, there's an unveiling of the headstone at that grave site, and that sort of signifies the symbolic spirit going off to Hawaiki. Historically, pre-European, at that time, the body would be dug up and the bones would be cleaned and placed in a cave or some other place so that the journey could be completed. So you can immediately see then what that meant for Maori with their people being killed on the battlefields. None of that could happen at all. These bodies to remain in a foreign land. The government of the day, as I said, all New Zealanders who died overseas remained overseas, and that happened right up until the Korean War. And after that, then there was more active repatriation. Quite a number of delegations by different iwi, different tribes, went to Parliament to be given funds to travel so that some rituals and things could be carried out. So we can already see that there's a disconnect with against that really logical, practical thing. There wouldn't have been enough refrigerated transport available, for example, to bring dead people back. It took 3 years to bring the living back. Like the last soldier was living soldier was repatriated back in 1921 back to New Zealand. So it's that enormity of distance, time, and cost as well. And we had refrigerated transport because New Zealand's big market at that time was exporting sheep to Europe, and we also sent off a lot of wool. And ironically, probably most of the German soldiers were wearing coats made out of New Zealand wool. They were our biggest wool purchasing people. And there was a lot of dissent after the war because there was a blockade on Germans buying our wool, and that was really hard for people. So how was pilgrimages sort of reported in the press? And a couple of little examples there. There wasn't a huge amount, I have to say, in the newspapers when I was sort of looking for this. This letter was published very shortly after the end of the war. So he's describing the ground and walking on the ground. I made a pilgrimage across to the front where our men had fought so cheerfully and bitterly. I can't think people fighting cheerfully in the Western Front, but they're a little bit of propaganda there, trying to create an image of what things would have been like. But also Anzac Day is April the 25th, but there was services in England, and if people could go to those services who were living in England and join and participate. So again, sort of pilgrimage by proxy with that. So New Zealand's repatriation policy, as I've touched on, the remains from World War I and both World War II were to stay where they are buried. And we can understand that policy. And I think, when we look at history from our modern context, we can't sort of overlay our contemporary thinking into a situation and a time then. People accepted, it seems that society accepted that was what had to be, that's where those people were. And there was nothing that I've read or could see that challenged that notion that actually this was not right. So even though with Maori there was that cultural aspect that it actually would have been okay to dig people up and bring them home, the general consensus was that no, that wasn't okay, and also of course not practical. And when you walk around the sites like you would have done here the many times around Belgium and France, and you immediately know the differences. And I've visited quite a few of the American cemeteries as well, where the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries often little random little places around where they might have been a first aid post, a casualty clearing station. Of course, there were some concentration cemeteries like Tyncott, but there wasn't that activity of bringing everyone to one big sort of super big cemetery. And I love when I've walked around those little cemeteries, invariably we'll find one little Kiwi soldier there, or there might be a Kiwi who was fighting for another country. And they're a long way from home. And if they're lucky, there might be another New Zealander in there as well. But what really hits home to me is that their families probably never got to see those graves. But now my generation and younger generations, of course, it's great pride to go and visit and be able to say, I've seen my ancestors' grave. So there were frequent ship passengers going. So I did some little calculations. It cost a third class ticket was between £24 and £35. And that equated to about 15% of the annual income. So a salary in 1921 for a New Zealand male was about £204 for a sort of middling kind of job. So 15% of the income, plus going away for probably up to 2 to 3 months to actually go. So we can immediately see that the logistics wasn't there. So this image that I've got here, this is our unknown warrior from World War One. So in there is a real body who was reinterred, taken from a site in a Belgium cemetery, I believe, in 2004, and was brought to New Zealand to our National War Memorial. And this is a sacred ground for pilgrimage, and it's symbolic of the 30,000 dead Kiwis from all conflicts. Up until post-1955, when the repatriation policies changed, families could do it, but they had to pay. But then that really quickly changed because you could see that that's wouldn't have been a popular policy. And in 2018, we had 37 people repatriated from Malaysia, Singapore, Fiji, from different conflicts. And this modern pilgrimages to the battlefield. So this is our tomb of the unknown soldier, and it's in Wellington. And this is the tomb here, and he looks out over the city of Wellington. And this is an amazing. I took this photo in February this year. These, I guess, like totem poles, we call them. They're representative of both Australia and New Zealand. And there's an Australian tree there and a New Zealand tree, some Aboriginal carvings and Maori carvings. And this stone is meant to represent the red earth from Australia as well, because they're on New Zealand ground. So we don't need to represent New Zealand ground, but it's acknowledging our shared collective history. And the tomb is here. And this is the war memorial behind him. And what I really like about this is this space is both sacred, but very ordinary as well. This here is just a path people walk to and fro. The University Wellington, Massey University Wellington is just behind it. So there's lots of activity, there's lots of offices around, so people can walk past and engage with this tomb of the unknown soldier on a daily, regular basis, or they can choose to ignore it, or they might not even know what it means. Underneath this is a tunnel called Arras Tunnel, named after Arras in France, where our Kiwi tunnellers did amazing things. And on our most sacred day, which is the 25th of April, Anzac Day, this is where the official commemoration ceremonies happen. It's not shut away from public access. It's not something that you need special permission to go to see. And after World War One, local memorials cropped up in every single town in New Zealand, every small community that had a loss or had someone who served. And they contained the names of the dead, and some memorials had all of the names of the people who served. And these became the proxy battlefields for commemoration. And there's over 1,000 of them around the country, and this is a map of them. Where there's no memorials, that's a mountain range down there. And this is a volcanic area where no one lives. So you can see New Zealand is very, very well covered. And this is an example. This is me visiting a person's relatives, not my relative, a friend's relative's grave in Le Quesnay in France, which is a really important historic site for New Zealanders. We liberated that town from the Germans, climbing up a ladder over the wall, but we had many sacrifices there. So this is what it means, that we put our flag in front of the grave and we recognise and remember that that person is a New Zealander there. And these local memorials become a place for pilgrimage. With that, they're very special. They're very respected. They're looked after. They're cared for by people, and it's almost like a surrogate tomb for their family member. And this one here on the left, so I've got a bit of a shadow there. This actually is my all-time favourite commemorative memorial. This is in a little cemetery in the west coast of New Zealand, a little town called Kumara. It's our local greenstone, Punamu, which comes from that area, which is very, very sacred. Just a block of the stone. There's 2 nurses on there who came from that area, who died when the Marquette ship was torpedoed. 10 nurses died. It was our worst disaster affecting nurses in World War One. This one here, Mabel Jamison, her body was never found. Helena Isdell, our body was found, believed to be her, but her name is not on her grave in Mithra Cemetery in Greece, because they couldn't completely identify that it was her. She was wearing her watch with her name on it, but they said that wasn't enough. But you see here, like 3 names from the same family, 3 names from the same, and this was a teeny tiny little community. This is another one that's in the west coast, and then this one here it's actually sort of chopped off a bit, but there's the memorial is off to the side on the grounds of the RSA, which is our Return Service Association, and with a gun there. So we're going to move forward 50 years to the 50th anniversary of Gallipoli and the 50-year pilgrimage to Gallipoli. And this is a really, really important pilgrimage attached to this photo here. This is my nurse, Mabel Crook, that I have researched. She was the only New Zealand nurse that went on this, and this is an Australian nurse. She was the only New Zealand nurse that went on this pilgrimage to Gallipoli. She served on hospital ships off Gallipoli. She was shot at. There's a splinter of wood in our museum where a bullet went past her head and killed the person next to her. She just carried on caring for these wounded. She was invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the king. She declined. She felt like she didn't do anything extra special. She just was doing her job. She was not allowed to go to this pilgrimage because the government didn't believe she'd been there. And that the correspondence in her files makes me really angry, that they didn't believe she'd been there because she was on a British ship. As a New Zealand nurse, she was on a British ship. And she had to really fight to get, A, the Gallipoli medal to recognise that she had served, and B, that she could go on this pilgrimage. And the irony is she was a really extensive photographer, and her albums now are held in the Army Museum as a permanent record, and her diaries, which is what I've transcribed for my book. So she made this 50-year Gallipoli pilgrimage, and the notes sort of say that the trip itself was not well organised. They were funded to go. It cost £650, but veterans didn't have to pay that, but if family members wanted to go. The accommodation was described as cramped. They did take a plane to Athens, and then they spent 3 weeks on this cruise ship. And then a certain number of them, this is a boat landing at Anzac Cove in Gallipoli, remembering what would have happened with the landings 50 years ago. And both the governments of Australia and New Zealand, so it was a combined thing, felt that pilgrimage was important to keep the memory alive for the younger generation. And that remains today. And there's this little poem here that was written called The Anzac Pilgrim's Progress. And it was written in Gallipoli, I believe by an Australian. But I think the words, say those dead of yours and mine, make this barren shore a shrine. All these graves, they draw us back, and forever in our track. Down the years to come will pace, pilgrims of our Anzac race. God, while this old earth shall stand, where but here's our holy land. And that sentiment, and this flag that I've used as a backdrop there was actually a flag that was at Gallipoli. So that sense is very much in our psyche. So if we go forward another 50 years, so we're now in 2015, and this photo it's a photo from a newspaper, hasn't come out so well. In 2015, I made, it was my second trip to Gallipoli actually, but this was a specific trip for nurses. Nurses from Australia and New Zealand, so we travelled to Gallipoli, but also the site where the Marquette ship was lost, and we sailed over that site. This is me here in my World War I nurse's uniform, and my son, who at the time was 17, last year at high school studying history. And I said, I'm going on this trip with a whole lot of nurses. And he's like, I'll come with you, Mum. And I'm like, I don't think you'll enjoy it. It's not a young person's trip. He had the time of his life because he was given this uniform to wear. He was representing the New Zealand soldiers. He was made an absolute fuss of and went on to do a history degree after this. So influenced his life. And this pilgrimage, and it very much was a pilgrimage so the Marquette ship, 23rd of October, 1915, was a transport ship that had a New Zealand hospital on that was being relocated to go to Salonika, now Thessaloniki in Greece. And because it wasn't marked as a hospital ship, it was a legitimate target, and it was torpedoed by the Germans. And 10 New Zealand nurses perished there, plus a whole lot of New Zealand medics and hundreds of donkeys, and all of the medical equipment was lost. So we made this pilgrimage to this site. We sailed over the exact site where the ship was, and this is where this wreath of flowers is over there. I've actually sailed over that site twice. And honestly, it was the most emotional feeling because the day, this one was early morning. The first visit was actually in the middle of the day, or in the evening, sorry. And it was the most beautiful day, clear blue waters. We couldn't imagine what it was like. And we had our New Zealand flag flying, and the ship circled around and then tooted its horn 7 times. And we had people on the ship who were descendants of some of those nurses reading their letters, their poems, and we all threw poppies and flowers in the water. It was the most amazing thing. And to stand in the waters here on the island of Lemnos, which is where the hospital was taking the wounded from Gallipoli. And another couple of photos there. This little island here is Lemnos, and that's Turkey over there. So Lemnos was Greece, Turkey over here. It was 42 degrees Celsius that day. Stinking hot. We were in woolen dresses. And we were walking over this ground. It was scratchy, it was hot, it was prickly, but we all felt we had to do it. We had to walk this ground that these nurses had walked on to care for their soldiers. The nurses at the time, they were given half a pint of water per day because the military engineers had sited the hospital in the wrong location. There was actually a spring over the other side of the hill that they didn't realise, a spring known to the ancient Greeks. And it was the most magical day of being in great discomfort, but great joy of actually having that opportunity. And then this photo here is Anzac Cove. Any New Zealander or Australian that's travelled will have this photo in their collection, that we're going there and understanding what this meant, what it meant for our people to be sent to this location. And I'm just going to close. I'm hoping this is going to work. It's showing the role of haka, which is the traditional Maori war dance in pilgrimage. To see that particular haka, kamati, is actually in my nurse's diary. She had written it out as well. So I'll just share. I've got a last couple of slides.
Okay.
So just really in closing is showing that contemporary pilgrimage to these locations is still really, really important. This is 2017. One of our most well-known historians, Glenn Harper, who taking a pilgrimage to Passchendaele. And if anyone's walked around battlefield sites in France, Belgium, to New Zealand locations, we'll see this symbolism of our soldiers, and it's actually our fern leaf, which is our national symbol. And of course, every Anzac Day, New Zealand and Australian soldiers go and stand there and have the dawn service, which people, public can go to as well. Many, many thousands of people go to those. I've never wanted to go to an Anzac Day service at Anzac on Anzac Day to Gallipoli, because I just think there's just too many people and you can't get that sort of sense of space and temporality, I guess, around that. But it is a really important thing for people to do. So I just really want to say thanks again, Heather, for that opportunity to share a little bit about pilgrimage and New Zealand. And I had this photo taken of me, and I love sharing it because I just like to think that those nurses back there in 42-degree heat with not much water would have absolutely taken their stockings off and put their feet into that water. But bearing in mind where their hospital was, that harbour, there would be dead horses, dead donkeys, there was blood, there was, it wasn't as pretty looking as that. So thank you. And there's just some contact details there if anyone wants to get in touch with me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the slides and for sharing about your own personal pilgrimages to these places. I was thinking, I wrote down a couple of questions that I wanted to follow up with you about. The first one, at the same time as you are traveling to Gallipoli in 2015, I was teaching at the University of Southern Queensland, and I was supervising a student who was doing her honors thesis on the pilgrimage to Gallipoli that year. And
Wow.
and I wish that she would publish the research. I think it is still relevant, even though we're what 11 by the time it would be published, 12 years probably beyond when it actually happened. But it's important because she did a thematic analysis on interview transcripts. She had conducted semi-structured interviews, and I think all of the participants were Australian. Um, a couple of the themes that emerged had to do with the myth of mateship, and then also national identity. And I'm wondering if those would be similar themes for New Zealanders who were going on the 2015 pilgrimage at the same time. What would have been some of the similarities or maybe some of the differences in how a Kiwi would have perceived the same pilgrimage?
Yeah. I think certainly from that ship, so we had Australian nurses, New Zealand nurses, and family people, and some people were just on because they thought it looked like a really nice, interesting cruise to do. So we were on a boat the whole time, and there the overwhelming sense was that mateship certainly there, and those connections. The overwhelming sense that we felt and discussed a lot was how pointless it all was, and how unnecessary, and the extreme loss of life and the decisions and things that were being made about by the British government and about the Australian and New Zealanders that were there supporting, and there was always this thing as Anzac Day or the Gallipoli, the birth of our nation and our national identity kind of thing, and there's a lot of discourse and things around that. It really depends who you speak to, I think. But I know, like when I first did my OE at 2021 or something, went off to Europe. If you met an Australian, you wouldn't know them, but if you heard an Australian first, if you heard a New Zealand accent, you're immediately friends. If you heard an Australian accent, that was the next best thing.
Yes.
It's like you knew that you were going to be okay with them, that they weren't going to rip you off or hurt you in any way, that you would share a flat or transport or food or whatever. So that has been an enduring kind of thing. The Australian nurses, a lot of them were on that trip was either had been active military nurses or were still active military nurses or had been active military nurses. So they had quite a different perspective. I think some of them were more quite regimental in their approach to some of the things, whereas for a lot of us, we were just there to see what nurses had done and to experience what they had done. Yeah.
When I was 22, I went to Turkey and spent about 6 weeks there exploring. My cousin and I went, and we bumped into Australian young people and Kiwis, and I always admired the camaraderie. Exactly as you've just described, they were always together in hostels, or in one place we were in Uttermost National Park, and there were some tree houses, cabins, and this was really popular with the Kiwis who were there at that time. And I I I really admired how people would come together, like you've described. You're a long way from home. People may not know each other, but they're immediately friends, and recognize this sense of kinship, and then would often travel to Gallipoli together, or further, go into the interior of Turkey together. And I thought that was really remarkable how all of these young people stuck together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that one of the very, very first trip I did to Gallipoli, I was just by myself and wasn't a military tour. I was actually going there to explore the rose fields in Turkey, and did a side trip down to Gallipoli. And I hadn't realised, but it was Ataturk's birthday. And I'd gone on this little minivan with this crazy driver. I don't know how we got there alive, but and it was full of all these Turkish people, and I can remember
the dolmuş vans, I think is what they call them, because they're like stuffed grape leaves where there's absolutely no room to be. I mean, one can barely breathe in these.
It was pretty hair raising, and I got to Anzac Cove, and I thought, why are all these Turkish people at our special place? And then I thought, hang on a minute, this is their country. I'm the visitor.
Yes.
And then I realised it was Ataturk's birthday, and of course they were celebrating their successes at Gallipoli. And so, and there was a young Aussie couple on that bus. I was the only Kiwi. There was a young Aussie couple, and then a whole load of Turkish people in this little van. And the Aussies, they were two medical students, I think, and really broke doing this tour. And we got back to Chanakali, I think we were, and we went to a little rooftop bar to have a drink, and they're like, "Oh, we'll just have a glass of water." And I'm like, "No, I'll buy you a beer." No, you can't. I said, "Look, come on. If a Kiwi can't buy an Aussie a beer after going to Gallipoli," I said, "just remember one day when you're wealthy doctors, you might see a broke nurse or a broke Kiwi, just buy them a beer, you know." And we had this lovely reflective moment about what it meant for us to be there, but also what it meant to be there on Ataturk's birthday.
Yes.
What it meant for the Turkish people, because we invaded their country.
Yes, and what it meant to be there with Turkish people, and maybe how they were perceiving you also being there on a day that was important to their national identity.
So I've had 3 visits to Gallipoli, and each time the vibe has been very, very different. The last time was 2018, and it was when there's a lot of Syrian refugees and things, and there was quite a nationalistic efforts by the Turkish government. So we felt quite unwelcome at that time on that particular trip. And so
interesting how the site stays the same and the circumstances change and you change, and that's one of the interesting elements of pilgrimage, I think, is just how we interact with sites and places of sacred importance.
Yeah. And I couldn't, but I was just going to say, when I first went to Anzac, I was shocked by the colour of the water and because all the images are black and white.
Yes.
And then I stepped into this crystal clear blue turquoise water and these beautiful little coloured stones, and I just stood there and let the water run over my feet, and I just looked up at the cliffs behind me, and I just, it's unimaginable, that this place of absolute beauty was that. So,
I had a similar thought. I did not get in the water, but I had a similar thought. It was quite overwhelming, actually, thinking about how peaceful it was in contrast with how violent it had been in the past. And there's something remarkable, I think, that makes the battlefield and the cemetery even more profound because of that really deep contrast between the historical events and visiting in a time when it's peaceful.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to ask you about, well, I'm really interested in this 1926 film, and I'm going to see, it would be wonderful to be able to see this Pilgrimages to War Graves in France film. That must be fascinating. And then I also wanted to ask you about whether the fact that the Maori soldiers were buried where they fell and were not repatriated back to New Zealand, to the homeland of their forefathers. What is the meaning of that in the current generation? Is there a sense that there's something missing? Is there a sense that this lack of closure has been passed down through generations, or a sense that people who either descendants or, maybe even people who are not direct descendants but are related need to make a pilgrimage because of that?
Yeah, I think very much so. And there has been very active efforts around, particularly more so Second World War with the Maori Battalion, because that, you know, that's those generation that survived are now, you know, not many left, if any left. So trying to sort of capture onto those. It is. There's been some TV series and things done very, very recently around Maori pilgrimage and also recognition of service, that some people didn't get medals and things like that, or medals. People chose to not get their medals because of various factors, and I think that's not just limited to New Zealand. So trying to find those families and disperse those medals to the appropriate people. It's very much in there is a real, what I see. I mean, I'm not Maori and I can't really speak for them, but there is a very much a sense of pride for any New Zealander, but certainly pride that their family member served and maybe made a sacrifice, or what knowledge and things was brought back. I was asked to write a report for our government last year around psychological welfare for Maori post World War II. So it was 1949 to 1989, and looking at a large number of sort of archival documents and things, and to see around that. So there were, for example, units obviously had chaplains to do Christian practices, but if there was a Maori chaplain, then he would also be able to do some more sort of traditional rituals and things around at funerals in World War One, World War Two as well. So there was some attempts and some considerations to try and meet some of those needs. It's still very much in people's collective memory. Like time hasn't made it less important. I think it's actually making it more important. The government did a huge amount around the 100-year commemorations of 2015 from Gallipoli onwards. Massive amount of resources, digitisation of all our records, those kinds of things. So people are really able to connect directly with content very, very easily.
I am wondering about this idea of England being the homeland. You referenced that at the beginning of your talk and in our conversation. And I imagine because the Western Front in particular is so far away, that people who go on pilgrimages often also stop in England, and that's a part of the pilgrimage is a return to that homeland before going on to France or Belgium. And I'm curious about how these points along the way create a bigger pilgrimage of identity, and what kind of meaning is made by connecting these points together.
Yeah. You mean like in a contemporary sense?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think certainly if we're going to travel to the other side of the world, we cram in as much as we can in as short a space as possible, rightly or wrongly. So if someone's going to France or Belgium specifically to look at battlefields, they'll go to England as well.
Yes.
We had a number of hospitals World War One hospitals were situated in New Zealand, so people might go to those locations, or they might go and find out where great grandma or whatever, the village that they grew up in. So there'll certainly be that. They may try and fit in Turkey as well to Gallipoli on that same trip as well. Many of my contemporaries do those sorts of trips, or it might not be their primary aim, but they're going to Europe for something, and then they'll tag on a visit to France, Belgium, if they can. Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense, and it's the case also for American pilgrims who are not so much the contemporary pilgrims, although that happens, but a lot of the archival materials that I've been looking at especially for the 1920s. It was the case because the United States also has such a uh, significant immigrant population at this time. And there were so many soldiers that were either recent citizens of the United States or maybe not even citizens of the United States. And their family members who are traveling to visit their graves often go to England or Ireland. I was just reading an account of a young woman who was visiting her brother. Well, she was visiting the battlefield. Her brother was buried in the United States, but she wanted to go to the battlefield, and their parents had been born in Ireland. And so she combines going to France to the battlefield with going to Ireland, and it kind of becomes this larger pilgrimage of identity, one that kind of predates the war and then the war itself, and it's kind of a comprehensive theme of continuity and identity.
Yeah. And I think you've touched on a really, really good thing there, that people are interested to know where they've come from.
That's right.
And here in New Zealand, we when you meet someone or greet someone, you, whether you're Maori or not, you tend to do like a little pepeha where you'll say where you're from and who your ancestors are before you say your name. And that's something we do in a professional sense, working sense all of the time. And we will say to people, oh, where are you from? Or where are you from? But we're not doing it in a way to challenge their right to be here. It's like we're genuinely interested. Where are you from? What's brought you to New Zealand? You know, tourists and that now. Oh, where are you from? What's brought you to New Zealand? And you know, where are your people from, or what language do you speak? It's done from a genuine sense of interest because, and I think it goes back to that fact that we know we are a long way away from anywhere. And a classic example, yesterday I gave a first class to an undergrad course that I'm covering, and a girl came up to me afterwards and she was asking me some questions. I was talking about health in New Zealand, and I picked up an accent and I said, oh, where are you from? And she's from Germany. And I'm like, oh, what's brought you to New Zealand? And she's chosen to take a year out of her German studies to spend a semester here. And we had a really, really good conversation about what she hoped to achieve about coming to New Zealand and what she would take back with her to Germany at the end of her studies. So we are really interested in exactly what you said. You know, people might have immigrated from somewhere or been in New Zealand for a couple of generations, and it's like, oh, well, you know, where are your ancestors from? Oh, my family come from Scotland as well, or, you know, in this little village. And it's all about building connections is what's important. Yeah.
I have the conference that I just went to in Quebec. I was mentioning before we started to record that there was a couple there from New Zealand who started their talk doing exactly this.
Uh-huh.
And I found it to be refreshing, profound, and what a gift to be able to have thought deeply about the question, where am I from? Well, I really admire this about your culture because I think it is important, and I don't know in the United States that we think about this so intentionally, and yet it shapes everything about how we view the world and how we approach other people. And I wish we would adopt this practice because it does set the stage. It places us in a greater community and a continuity that predates our physical existence in the world.
Yeah, very much. And for that couple you're talking about, if they were Maori, which I understand them to be,
Yes.
they would have said their mountain, their river,
Yes.
you know, their iwi, their tribe, all of those connections before saying their names.
Yes.
We as Tau iwi or non-Maori or Pakeha, we can't have a connection. We can't say we're from we can say that a mountain or river has a meaning to us, or we have a connection, or it might have sustained us, but we can't claim any rights to that mountain, so that we'd use some slightly different words and things around that. So we might say something like, we grew up in the shelter of a particular mountain, or I grew up by the banks of such and such a river, but we don't say we're from that mountain or that river. Yeah. But we have rivers in New Zealand. I think there's two now, maybe one, that they have status as people. They have the same rights as a person.
That's interesting.
A river and a mountain. Yeah. So it's that connection to land, for sure. Yeah.
And even the oral tradition itself is a pilgrimage, because it's always drawing someone back to their origins. And I think it's just beautiful.
Yeah.
Very beautiful tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's something that's in any formal work setting. If you're meeting someone for the first time, everyone would do that, and at the start of the meeting, so you would know immediately who, and that it dates back to, that the people come as a friend. Basically, they're not an enemy that you're going to, because you have a connection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I've got like 15 questions in my head, and then I think if I ask all 15, this will be a 3-hour or 4-hour endeavor. I do hope that we have the opportunity to speak again. I hope that I will get to see your writing in a future pilgrimage volume. That's what I really hope.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Yeah. Because I think we need the information collectively to understand the pilgrimage phenomenon and phenomena that happened after the war. Are you writing anything currently that would be interesting for listeners and viewers to know about?
Yes, there's actually, it's written, it's about to be published. There's a chapter in a book about military welfare, history of military welfare, and I'll send you the details. It's going to be published in August. That's been a piece of work that the editors have been working on for the last couple of years, and I've got a couple of articles in press around. It's not so much about pilgrim, it's about welfare of nurses, and just done a big analysis of their death certificates of returning nurses who died prematurely after their service. And that's taken me down a whole route of breast cancer and suicide, so which have not previously been written about. So they're sort of the two bits that I'm sort of working on. Technically it's not part of my day job, so any of this kind of writing is happening in my spare time.
Yes.
But so finding time, and having spent the last and there's conference proceedings as well I need to write up, where I've talked about the deaths of the nurses after service and what happened to them. So, but my little book, probably hard for the American people to get hold of, because
let's put who's the publisher? I will link it.
It's self-published.
Okay.
So I do have copies, but I don't know what it would cost to send. But I'll send you the information, because if someone so it's an annotated diary of Mabel Crook, and I've gone through her diary, and then everything she's mentioned in her diary, I've gone and got all of the facts around what was happening at that time.
That's fantastic.
So,
Okay, great. So we can link that at the end. And thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to probably get up a bit earlier. Maybe
not for me. No, it's normal working day for me.
Yes,
so.
I completely mucked up the time before our scheduling. So, and then we had to reschedule because of weather issues. So it's nice to finally be here.
Yeah, no, really appreciate the opportunity, Heather, and lovely to meet you properly on screen and have a chat, and fabulous podcast. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.